The moment the cameras flashed across the Grand Summit Hall, the tension was so thick it felt like the air itself was about to crack, world leaders sitting stiff in their chairs as Donald Trump entered with his signature confident stride. Yet something was different this time, something cold and unmistakable, because instead of handshakes and warm smiles, several leaders slowly turned away, whispering among themselves, creating a chilling visual that instantly sent shockwaves through global media, signaling that the political ground beneath Trump was shifting fast. For years, Trump had dominated international stages with bold statements, aggressive negotiations, and an unapologetic America First approach. But now, the same allies who once stood beside him appeared hesitant, distant, even openly resistant, as if the world was quietly drawing a line in the sand. Behind closed doors, diplomats spoke in hushed tones about growing fears of global conflict, escalating tensions in key regions, and Trump's unpredictable leadership style pushing fragile alliances to their breaking point. Some leaders reportedly felt blindsided by sudden policy shifts, abrupt military decisions, and public criticisms that strained relationships built over decades, transforming cooperation into cautious confrontation. As Trump took his seat, his sharp gaze scanned the room, noticing the lack of eye contact, the forced smiles, the deliberate avoidance, and in that moment, it became clear that this wasn't just political drama. It was the warning sign of a world growing restless. News networks replayed the footage endlessly, analyzing every turned shoulder, every whispered exchange, every leader who chose to greet someone else instead of Trump, framing it as a symbolic rejection that could reshape global power dynamics. And as headlines screamed about war looming on the horizon, one question echoed across the globe. Had Trump finally pushed America's allies too far? Part 2. Tensions had been building for months, quietly at first, then suddenly erupting into open disagreements over trade wars, military strategies, and international treaties, with Trump frequently calling out allies for not paying their fair share while threatening to pull support from long-standing agreements. European leaders grew increasingly frustrated, feeling that Trump treated diplomacy like a business transaction rather than a partnership built on trust, leading to sharp exchanges during summits that were once known for unity. In Asia, concerns mounted over rising military posturing, with Trump's bold warnings and rapid troop movements sparking fear that even a small miscalculation could ignite widespread conflict. Middle Eastern leaders watched closely as alliances shifted overnight, unsure whether Trump's next decision would stabilize the region or push it closer to chaos. Insiders revealed that several countries had begun quietly forming alternative diplomatic strategies, preparing for a future where American leadership under Trump could no longer be relied upon. Publicly, leaders remained cautious with their words, but their actions spoke volumes: delayed meetings, canceled visits, and cold receptions that painted a picture of growing isolation. The world wasn't just disagreeing with Trump anymore, it was slowly stepping away. Trump, however, seemed unfazed on the surface, continuing his speeches with trademark confidence, claiming that tough leadership was necessary to keep America strong and respected. But behind the scenes, advisors reportedly warned him that the diplomatic damage was becoming severe. Some urged him to soften his tone, rebuild relationships, and reassure allies, while others encouraged doubling down, believing fear and pressure were effective tools. The split within his own circle reflected the larger global divide: cooperation versus confrontation. As military exercises increased and defense budgets surged across nations, analysts warned that the world was entering one of its most unstable periods in decades. Social media exploded with speculation about secret meetings, emergency military preparations, and intelligence briefings hinting at worst-case scenarios. Every aggressive statement, every troop movement, every diplomatic snub added fuel to a fire that many feared was already burning out of control. What once felt like political posturing now carried the weight of real-world consequences. Public opinion worldwide began shifting rapidly, with citizens questioning whether Trump's leadership was protecting global stability or pushing it toward disaster. Protests erupted in several countries, demanding leaders distance themselves from American policies they believed were reckless. Meanwhile, Trump's supporters praised his strength, arguing that he was finally standing up to nations that had taken advantage of the U.S. for too long. News commentators clashed nightly, some calling Trump a necessary disruptor, others labeling him a dangerous wild card. Behind diplomatic curtains, emergency summits were reportedly held to discuss crisis management plans should conflict break out. Nations began reinforcing borders, strengthening cyber defenses, and preparing for potential economic fallout. The world was no longer just watching. it was bracing. As history has shown time and again, moments like these often serve as turning points, where leaders either pull back from the edge or push forward into chaos. Trump's bold approach had undoubtedly shaken the global system, exposing cracks in alliances that many believed were unbreakable. Whether his strategy would ultimately force stronger cooperation or lead to devastating conflict remained uncertain. What was clear, however, was that the world was changing fast, and Trump stood at the center of the storm. World leaders turning their backs wasn't just symbolic. It was a warning that trust was fading, tensions were rising, and the path ahead was more dangerous than ever. And as the drums of war seemed to grow louder with each passing day, the question remained, would diplomacy prevail, or was the world headed toward a conflict that would redefine history? As diplomatic tensions continued to rise, intelligence agencies across the world reportedly increased surveillance and emergency briefings, with analysts warning that even a small spark could trigger a chain reaction no one would be able to stop, while Trump's bold rhetoric echoed through global headlines, sending markets into nervous swings and pushing governments into crisis mode. Behind closed doors, foreign ministers rushed between meetings, urgently discussing backup alliances and alternative defense plans, preparing for a future where America might no longer act as the steady global anchor it once was. Some leaders quietly admitted that Trump's unpredictability made it impossible to plan long-term strategies, forcing them to rely on rapid response decisions instead of diplomatic stability. Military drills intensified in strategic regions, fighter jets roared across skies that once symbolized peace, and naval fleets positioned themselves closer to contested waters, all signs that the world was bracing for potential conflict. Citizens watched nervously as news tickers flashed warnings of escalating tensions, wondering how quickly political disagreements could turn into something far more devastating. Every press conference became a moment of suspense, every tweet a potential trigger, as Trump's words carried enormous weight in an already fragile environment. The global stage was transforming from diplomacy to defense preparation in real time. Trump remained defiant, insisting that strong pressure was the only way to force other nations to respect American interests, portraying himself as the leader willing to do what others were too afraid to attempt. He repeatedly accused world leaders of taking advantage of the U.S. for decades, framing his confrontational approach as a long overdue correction. Supporters applauded his boldness, claiming he was finally putting America first instead of bending to global expectations. But critics argued that leadership wasn't about intimidation. It was about cooperation, stability, and trust, all of which seemed to be slipping away under Trump's aggressive strategies. Former diplomats warned that isolating allies historically led to dangerous power vacuums where rival nations stepped in to reshape global influence. They pointed out that when alliances weaken, conflicts often follow, as misunderstandings grow and communication breaks down. What Trump saw as strength, many others saw as a gamble with global peace. Meanwhile, rival powers began quietly expanding their influence, hosting secret talks with countries growing uncertain about America's reliability. Economic partnerships were renegotiated, military cooperation increased, and strategic alliances formed that could shift the global balance of power. Some analysts suggested that Trump's confrontational approach was unintentionally pushing nations closer to America's rivals, creating new blocks of influence. The world was slowly reorganizing itself, not around unity, but around survival and strategic advantage. Global institutions struggled to mediate conflicts. As trust in traditional leadership structures weakened, emergency meetings were held to prevent miscommunication between militaries, fearing accidental clashes that could spiral out of control. The fragile global order that had existed for decades was being tested like never before. Inside the United States, reactions were deeply divided, with rallies both supporting and opposing Trump's foreign policies erupting across major cities. Some Americans felt proud of a president who refused to bow to international pressure, while others feared the long-term consequences of alienating allies. Experts debated nightly on television, presenting scenarios ranging from diplomatic breakthroughs to full-scale conflict. Veterans spoke about the real cost of war, reminding viewers that behind political strategies were lives that could be forever changed. Families watched anxiously, wondering if another generation might be sent into global battles shaped by political pride and miscalculation. The emotional weight of potential conflict settled heavily on the nation. This was no longer just politics. It was about the future of global peace. As history unfolded before the world's eyes, one truth became increasingly clear. The era of predictable diplomacy was fading. replaced by a volatile landscape shaped by bold moves and unpredictable consequences. Trump's leadership had shaken global relationships to their core, forcing nations to rethink alliances, strategies, and trust. Whether this disruption would ultimately lead to a stronger, fairer world order or plunge nations into devastating conflict remained unknown. World leaders turning their backs wasn't just a moment caught on camera. It symbolized a deep fracture in international unity. The stakes had never been higher, and the margin for error had never been smaller. Every decision from this point forward carried the power to reshape history. And as the world stood on the edge of uncertainty, the question echoed louder than ever. Would diplomacy find a way to heal the divides, or was humanity heading toward a conflict that would change everything forever? As history has shown time and again, moments like these often serve as turning points, where leaders either pull back from the edge or push forward into chaos. Trump's bold approach had undoubtedly shaken the global system, exposing cracks in alliances that many believed were unbreakable. Whether his strategy would ultimately force stronger cooperation or lead to devastating conflict remained uncertain. What was clear, however, was that the world was changing fast, and Trump stood at the center of the storm. World leaders turning their backs wasn't just symbolic. It was a warning that trust was fading, tensions were rising, and the path ahead was more dangerous than ever. And as the drums of war seemed to grow louder with each passing day, the question remained, would diplomacy prevail, or was the world headed toward a conflict that would redefine history? As weeks passed, diplomatic silence between the United States and several major allies grew louder than any public argument, with unanswered calls, delayed responses, and carefully worded statements signaling a deep freeze in relationships that once defined global cooperation. Foreign newspapers began openly questioning whether America could still be trusted as a reliable partner under Trump's leadership, while political commentators described the situation as the most serious breakdown in alliances in modern history. Behind the scenes, intelligence reports reportedly highlighted rising risks of misunderstandings between military forces stationed in tense regions, where a single mistake could quickly escalate into violence. World leaders became increasingly cautious in their public appearances, carefully avoiding direct association with Trump while emphasizing their own national security priorities. Emergency diplomatic channels were quietly activated to prevent potential clashes, showing just how close tensions were believed to be. Markets continued to fluctuate wildly as investors reacted to each new development, reflecting global uncertainty about the future. The world was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Trump responded to growing isolation with even stronger language, accusing certain nations of betrayal and warning that America would no longer tolerate what he described as unfair treatment. He framed the situation as a battle between American strength and global weakness, insisting that history would prove his approach right. Supporters echoed his message, seeing the diplomatic pushback as proof that Trump was challenging a broken international system. Opponents, however, feared that his escalating rhetoric was burning bridges that might never be rebuilt. Former world leaders publicly urged calm, reminding audiences of the importance of dialogue over confrontation. They warned that once trust is lost, it becomes incredibly difficult to restore. Yet Trump showed no signs of stepping back. As political tensions rose, military budgets increased across multiple nations, signaling preparation for uncertain times ahead. New weapons systems were unveiled, advanced defense technologies tested, and troops placed on higher alert levels. Some governments quietly expanded underground shelters and emergency response plans, preparing for worst-case scenarios. Citizens noticed increased security measures in major cities, adding to the growing sense of unease. Schools practiced emergency drills, and governments issued public safety guidelines. Subtle reminders that global stability was fragile. Media outlets discussed potential conflict zones daily, mapping out possible flashpoints across the world. The threat of war no longer felt distant, it felt real. Diplomatic experts began drawing comparisons to historical moments when miscommunication and pride led nations into devastating conflicts. They pointed to past leaders who believed strength alone could prevent war, only to discover that unchecked confrontation often had the opposite effect. These warnings echoed across international forums, urging restraint and renewed cooperation. Some leaders attempted to act as mediators, proposing peace talks and neutral negotiation spaces. But trust had been damaged so deeply that even offers of dialogue were met with skepticism. Each side feared appearing weak, and pride stood in the way of compromise. The world seemed trapped in a dangerous standoff. Despite the growing tension, there were still quiet efforts happening behind the scenes to prevent the worst from unfolding. Secret diplomatic meetings reportedly took place in neutral countries, aiming to reopen lines of communication. Some advisors pushed for confidence-building measures to ease fears and reduce military posturing. Yet the public narrative remained one of confrontation and looming danger. Whether these hidden efforts would succeed remained uncertain. What was clear was that the world had entered a critical moment where leadership choices would determine the future of global peace. And as the drama continued to unfold, humanity stood at a crossroads between cooperation and conflict, between diplomacy and disaster. As history has shown time and again, moments like these often serve as turning points, where leaders either pull back from the edge or push forward into chaos. Trump's bold approach had undoubtedly shaken the global system, exposing cracks in alliances that many believed were unbreakable. Whether his strategy would ultimately force stronger cooperation or lead to devastating conflict remained uncertain. What was clear, however, was that the world was changing fast, and Trump stood at the center of the storm. World leaders turning their backs wasn't just symbolic. It was a warning that trust was fading, tensions were rising, and the path ahead was more dangerous than ever. And as the drums of war seemed to grow louder with each passing day, the question remained, would diplomacy prevail, or was the world headed toward a conflict that would redefine history? As global uncertainty deepened, news of sudden military movements began appearing across international headlines, with convoys rolling through strategic regions and naval forces repositioning in key waterways, signaling that nations were preparing not just for diplomacy, but for potential confrontation. Satellite images circulated showing increased activity at military bases, fueling speculation about imminent conflict. Governments issued carefully worded statements urging calm, yet their actions told a different story, one of readiness and caution. Citizens around the world felt the tension in everyday life, from rising fuel prices to shortages of essential goods, as supply chains reacted to instability. Families discussed emergency plans, while communities whispered about the possibility of war becoming reality. The psychological impact of looming conflict spread quickly, shaping daily conversations and media coverage. Fear was no longer confined to political circles. It had reached ordinary people everywhere. Trump continued to frame the unfolding events as a necessary test of strength, claiming that showing weakness would invite aggression from rival powers. He insisted that his approach would ultimately force global respect and restore balance. His speeches grew more intense, filled with warnings and bold promises to protect American interests at all costs. Supporters rallied behind him, chanting slogans of strength and independence. Yet critics argued that his words were escalating tensions rather than calming them. Diplomatic analysts warned that rhetoric alone could push nervous nations into defensive actions that spiraled out of control. The line between strong leadership and dangerous provocation seemed thinner than ever. Across Europe and Asia, leaders held emergency summits discussing joint defense strategies and economic safeguards in case conflict erupted. New alliances were quietly strengthened, while old agreements were revised to prepare for uncertain times. Some nations increased cyber defenses, fearing digital attacks could be the first wave of a broader conflict. Experts explained that modern warfare wouldn't just be fought on battlefields, but through technology, economies, and information. The world was entering a new kind of standoff, one where threats were invisible yet powerful. This shift made tensions even harder to control, as small cyber incidents could be misinterpreted as acts of war. Global stability hung by a thread. Within diplomatic circles, frustration grew as efforts to bring Trump and other leaders to the negotiation table repeatedly stalled. Some officials privately admitted that personal pride and political pressure were blocking meaningful compromise. Leaders feared backlash at home if they appeared too soft in the face of growing threats. As a result, posturing replaced progress, and bold statements replaced quiet solutions. Historians warned that many past wars began exactly this way, through stubbornness, fear, and failure to communicate. The world seemed to be repeating old mistakes in a modern setting. The consequences, however, could be far more devastating. Yet even in the darkest moments, there remained a fragile hope that diplomacy could still prevail. Some leaders quietly pushed for renewed dialogue, believing that mutual understanding was the only path away from disaster. They worked behind the scenes, away from cameras and headlines, trying to rebuild trust step by step. Whether their efforts would succeed remained uncertain. Trump's influence on the global stage continued to shape every development, making him both a central figure of power and controversy. The world watched closely, aware that each decision could change the course of history. And as tension filled the air, one truth became undeniable. Humanity stood at a critical crossroads, where the choices of a few could determine the fate of millions. As history has shown time and again, moments like these often serve as turning points, where leaders either pull back from the edge or push forward into chaos.